For almost a quarter century in the United States Senate, Lindsey Graham was known for a lot of things. His voice on foreign policy, his friendship with John McCain, his late career alliance with Donald Trump. But there was one thing that followed him through every campaign, every debate, every headline, and that he never really explained. He never married, and he never had children of his own. Reporters asked. Rivals joked about it. Voters wondered what it would mean to have an unmarried bachelor in the Oval Office. Graham always answered with a laugh and moved on. Then, within days of his sudden death at 71, the country got a much clearer picture of the real story. And it turned out to have almost nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with a promise he made when he was barely out of his teens. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a small blue-collar town where his parents ran a restaurant, pool hall, bar, and liquor store known locally as the Sanitary Cafe. For years, the family lived in a single room behind the business itself before eventually moving next door once things stabilized. Graham grew up working in that pool hall, learning the rhythms of small-town Southern life long before anyone imagined him chairing a Senate committee. He was the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina. Those plans were interrupted by tragedy before he'd even finished his degree. His mother, Millie, died of Hodgkin lymphoma when Graham was 20. 15 months later, his father, Florence James Graham, died suddenly of a heart attack. In the space of little more than a year, Graham had lost both parents, and he was left as the only adult in the room for his younger sister, Darlene, who was still a young teenager. There was no wealthy relative ready to step in. There was a young man, not yet finished with his own schooling, and a grieving kid who now depended on him completely. Friends who knew Graham at the time have said the loss forced him to grow up almost overnight. He finished his undergraduate degree, then went on to law school at the same university, all while effectively becoming his sister's parent. Rather than send Darlene to live with relatives, Graham decided to raise her himself. After he entered the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps and began active duty in 1982, he took the additional step of becoming her legal guardian, a decision that meant she could be covered under his military benefits, and one that made official what had already become true in practice. He was her family now. That wasn't a symbolic gesture. Balancing an intense legal career in uniform with the demands of raising a young teenager who had just lost both parents meant handling the ordinary, exhausting parts of parenting, school, discipline, grief, all of it, while finishing a law degree and building a career that would eventually stretch across 33 years of total Air Force service, including a stint as a military prosecutor and defense attorney at Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany. Being stationed overseas while raising a teenager back in South Carolina added a layer of difficulty that rarely made it into political profiles of his career. He leaned on a small circle of family friends in Central to help fill the gaps, and made a point of returning home on leave whenever he could to check on her. It was, by any measure, an unusual arrangement for someone barely in his 20s, one that left very little space for the kind of dating and courtship most people his age were pursuing. Graham's political career moved fast once his sister was grown and his active duty service was behind him. Assistant attorney for Oconee County, city attorney in his hometown, a seat in the South Carolina House in 1992, the U.S. House in 1994, and finally the Senate in 2002, where he succeeded the long-serving Strom Thurmond. He won re-election in 2008, 2014, and 2020, and had just won his primary again earlier this year. Much of his reputation in Washington was built alongside his close friend John McCain, along with Senator Joe Lieberman. The two were nicknamed the Three Amigos for their bipartisan work on defense and foreign policy. McCain used a joke that he'd seen Graham date plenty of women over the years, but never once seen him get close to marriage, a running gag between the two men whenever reporters raised the subject. When McCain was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2017, it was Graham who broke the news to fellow senators after speaking with him directly, and the friendship endured well past McCain's death in 2018. Graham stayed close with the McCain family for years afterward. Graham's legislative record reflected the same instinct to work across the aisle. He partnered with the late Ted Kennedy on comprehensive immigration reform in the mid-2000s, and later became one of the central Republican voices in the bipartisan Gang of Eight that produced a 2013 immigration bill, border security funding, visa reforms, and a pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants already in the country. The Senate passed it. The House never took it up. It cemented Graham's reputation as one of the GOP's most visible reform advocates, and it also drew fierce criticism from conservatives who called it amnesty regardless of the conditions attached. On foreign policy, Graham was one of the Senate's most consistent hawks, a frequent traveler to conflict zones during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and later, one of the loudest congressional voices supporting Ukraine after Russia's invasion. He visited the country multiple times and argued that supporting Kiev was a strategic investment in international stability, not just an act of charity. His relationship with Donald Trump went through a dramatic reversal. In 2016, Graham was one of Trump's sharpest Republican critics, at one point calling him a race-baiting bigot, after Trump proposed banning Muslims from entering the country, a moment that led Trump to publicly read out Graham's cell phone number at a rally. After McCain's death in 2018, Graham gradually became one of Trump's closest Senate allies, chairing the Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021, and later the Budget Committee starting in 2025. Through all of it, the marriage question kept coming up, especially during his brief 2016 presidential run. When reporters pressed him on who would serve as First Lady, Graham always deflected with joke and moved the conversation elsewhere. Here's where it's worth being precise about what's confirmed and what isn't. Graham's own biography, the version his campaign and his office told for decades, has always centered on the same core facts. He lost both parents in his early 20s, and he raised his teenage sister rather than let her go to relatives. His official obituary reiterated exactly that. Friends and colleagues have long connected those dots themselves, suggesting that a man who became a parent at 22, while still finishing school and starting a military legal career, simply never had the same runway toward marriage and a family of his own that his peers did. What's not established is any single, on-the-record explanation from Darlene herself laying out the real reason in her own words. What is on the record is this. Darlene Graham Nordun has spoken publicly about how close she and her brother remain for the rest of his life, including standing beside him as recently as this year, when he filed his re-election paperwork. When Graham died suddenly on July 11th, 2026, after what his office called a brief and sudden illness, later attributed by a preliminary medical finding to an aortic dissection connected to hardened arteries, it was Darlene who stepped into an extraordinary role in the days that followed. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster appointed Darlene Graham Nordun to serve out the remainder of her brother's term, at President Trump's recommendation. Trump had posted that the appointment would be a fabulous tribute to Lindsey, and Senator Tim Scott publicly backed the choice as well. Nordun was sworn in within days, becoming the first woman to represent South Carolina in the U.S. Senate. At the announcement, she offered one of the only truly personal, on-the-record lines of the entire week. Lindsey has always been there for me, and now I will be there for him. She added that it was a privilege to finish some of his work, and that she intended to support the president and carry her brother's efforts forward on behalf of South Carolina. Her appointment is temporary. The seat will be contested in a special primary in August, with a full term decided in the following election. But for now, it closes a kind of circle. The boy who became his little sister's guardian at 22 is, in his final chapter, succeeded in office by the very sister he raised. Tributes poured in from across the political spectrum after his death, including a personal remembrance from Meghan McCain, who described Graham as someone her family had come to think of as an extension of their own. Other tributes noted a detail that had quietly followed Graham his entire career. He died as the only sitting member of the Senate who had never married, a fact that, thanks to his sister's decades by his side, finally had context most people never had before. There's no confirmed scandal here, and no secret relationship the public was kept from. What the record actually shows is simpler. A 20-year-old college student lost both his parents, chose to raise his 11-year-old sister rather than see her scattered among relatives, and built the rest of his adult life. The military service, the law career, 3 decades in the Senate, on top of that decision. Every joke he made about rotating first lady sat on top of a choice he made half a century earlier and never walked back. Whether Darlene Graham Nordun ever puts the full explanation into her own words on the record remains to be seen. What's already clear, from the facts we do have, is that the life he built for his sister was never a footnote to his political career. It was a foundation underneath all of it,